All right. Hello, everybody. I hope the HDMI and Wi-Fi gods will be merciful today, since there's also a live demo involved. I'm Johannes Schickling. I'm based here actually in Berlin, so welcome to everybody not from Berlin. I'm working at a company called GraphQL. We are building a backend platform for GraphQL. And like probably most of you, I'm very much into cutting edge technologies. And I want to tell you a bit more today about the technology behind this graph. So if you check out Google Trends and you look for GraphQL, this is what it looks like. And I'd be very interested. Who of you has never heard about GraphQL before? Okay, I think I was right about the cutting edge technologies. So who of you uses GraphQL in production? All right, so for those, the first few minutes might be a bit boring, since I want to tell you a bit about the basics of GraphQL first. So let's motivate this with like a real-world example that a small web shop like Amazon might also run into. So if you would face the situation where you want to build a web shop, for example with Next.js, and you want to implement this design, what you actually, the problems you will run into is like, damn, there are like so many data dependencies, so how would I actually structure my REST API that I can get all of my data dependencies here? So either you end up with like one huge REST endpoint that gives you exactly what you want, what you probably won't, or you do a ton of REST requests to just get all of the data that you want. So if we break this down a little into a smaller use case of a web shop, and we take here, for example, we have a data item called item, which has an ID, a name, a string, a price, and also has some related information about its rating information. So how that would look like for a REST API, it could look like this, that you have like your API for your web shop, and on /items, you could just get all of your items. The problem here is what actually if you want to have related data as well. So you have two strategies. Either you say you want to keep your REST API completely flat, and what you would do is, like, if you would have 100 items, you would actually issue 101 REST requests, because you need to, on the client side, iterate over all of them and then fetch the rating information for each of them. So that's obviously not great, and that's called the N+1 query problem. So the other alternative would be to have a nested endpoint. And this nested endpoint, maybe you can still call it /items or items with rating. But the problem about this is that, especially on mobile connections, you really want to have as little data as possible in these endpoints. And but with these nested endpoints, they're just growing and growing and growing, and you would fetch, let's say, 70% more data than you actually need. So that's also bad. So and there's a big company that had this problem quite early on and at a massive scale. So they needed to think about a solution for this. This company is called Facebook, and the solution is called GraphQL. So they basically turn around the entire situation and say, okay, instead of having a lot of different REST endpoints, we have just one endpoint. This endpoint exposes a so-called schema, and against the schema, you can send queries. So think about it like this, that you have like a SQL database. For a SQL database, you don't have a lot of endpoints, but you have one endpoint where you send your SQL queries to. So GraphQL is very similar in that sense. Just that your queries actually look super simple. So this is what a GraphQL query could look like. So I think it's fairly intuitive to think about it like JSON, but just the keys. So in this case, we say, okay, we want to get all items, and for every item, we want to get a name. But we can actually also query nested data and traverse the entire graph. So here we want to get all items, their name, and also their rating information, including the count and the average rating. And if we send this query to your GraphQL API, the server kind of fills out this query and gives you back exactly the data that you're looking for. So I think that's a fairly intuitive pattern, and this is what GraphQL is all about. So here we have looked at a GraphQL query. There's also another concept in GraphQL to actually write your data. So here we're just reading data. So the equivalent here are called GraphQL mutations. So think about GraphQL mutations as a GraphQL query, but additionally to what you want to get back, you also tell the server what it should do. So the server not just exposes certain schema to read your data, but also think about like available functions that you can call that does something with your data. So in this case, we want to create a new item. We have to provide the name and the price, and we can read back the ID. I think that's also fairly intuitive. And additionally, GraphQL also has a concept for more real-time communication called GraphQL subscriptions. So the idea is here, instead of sending a query or mutation that returns something immediately, you're creating a subscription that establishes a long-running connection, for example, via WebSockets, and you listen to a certain type of event. So in this case, we say, okay, whenever something happens about an item, we want to get back this information. So we're waiting until something happens, and when something does happen, we immediately get it back. So for those of you who haven't heard about GraphQL before or who weren't familiar, I hope these ideas are somewhat intuitive, and we're going to see it shortly in a demo. To easier get started with GraphQL, we're actually next week officially release a new tool called GraphQL Playground. So it's kind of the easiest IDE how you can get started with GraphQL. We've just made it public. We will officially announce it next week. So if you want to get your own hands dirty with GraphQL, then you can try out neat features like auto-completions, a completely new way how to explore your docs that GraphQL exposes. So maybe the easiest way to try it out is quickly to do a quick demo. Let's see. We're not supposed to see that yet. Okay. That will be fun. Can I somehow change the display mirroring that I can see my own display? Give me a second. Okay, perfect. So how this basically looks like is that you can say, okay, here you started with an empty query and you have auto-completion support. So you say, okay, what do you have available? I want to get all items. For every item, I want to get its ID, the description, and also its image ID. I'm querying that, and I'm getting exactly back the information I'm looking for. Can also say, give me the rating information of this item, including the count and the average rating, and I'm getting back exactly this information. So I encourage you to just try that out on your own later. You can just find it here, GraphQL Playground, and you can try it out afterwards. But let's dive a bit deeper in the presentation. So GraphQL also has another feature called GraphQL SDL, which stands for Schema Definition Language, and that's just another characteristic that you should be familiar with, since this gives you a super neat way to describe the data model that you're working with when you're working with a GraphQL backend. So think about it like small type definitions where you describe exactly what your data model looks like. So here in the example that we've already dealt with, this is, for example, how it would look like that you specify you have a type, you have an item has price, name, and so on. So next, I want to speak a bit about the status quo, about how you would deal with data in your Next.js applications. So Kevin Lecker actually asked this like a bit more than a year ago, how you would connect to your database from your Next.js app. And there are basically two ways how you can deal with that. So either you actually do connect directly to your database, or you use an API layer in between. We afterwards also will talk a bit more about state management inside of your Next app. So if you were to connect directly to your database, you could, for example, do it using MongoDB and do it like this, that in your getInitialProps method, you would connect to it, you would check, am I on the server? You would connect to your database and return the initial data. But this is bad for various reasons. So one, it strongly couples real server implementation details that shouldn't be living in your Next app. And it's also pretty insecure if you're directly exposed to database connection. So this is probably not something that you should be doing. Another way would be that you build an API layer. So you basically proxy the access to your database. You implement this mapping from your database to your API, for example, using an ORM. And you would either build that as a REST API or a GraphQL API. And today we want to look into how we can do that using GraphQL. On the local state management side of your Next app, if it's really simple, you can just use a pattern where you're using props and state. If it gets a bit more sophisticated, you can use Redux. But with GraphQL, there might actually be a better way. And there is. So GraphQL doesn't just expose a schema on the server, but it also gives you a way how you can use GraphQL clients directly on the front end. So you can kind of think about this as SDKs, but that they're not proprietary, but they're compatible with every GraphQL API. So these includes features like it manages the cache of your local application. It abstracts away the networking layer so that it works with HTTP or with your WebSocket connection. There's also a lot of development at the moment around offline support. It also integrates directly with your different view layer integrations. So you might use it with Vue.js or React, what we're doing with Next today. And also typically these GraphQL clients have a lot of great tooling around them that, for example, allows you to verify your queries that you're writing in your local app at build time. So you no longer have really this guessing going on what a REST API might be giving back to you and it crashes in production. But with GraphQL, you can actually say, here's my React app, here are all of these queries that I'm having, and at build time, I'm verifying that my queries are valid and that the data that I'm querying is actually available. The GraphQL client that we want to look into today is called Apollo. It's by the folks that formerly run Meteor.js. You can easily install it using Apollo client and React Apollo. You basically have to do two things to use it. One is in the same way as you would be using Redux and provide this and inject this Redux provider, you would inject an Apollo provider. So Apollo is actually initially being built on top of Redux, so it shares a lot of the common concepts. And for each of your for each of your React components where you want to have data available, you can wrap them in a so-called container to query and inject the data directly. And as a bonus, since we want to have this in our Next.js application and we want to have server-side rendering support, we would also implement the getInitialProps method. So this is how it would look like where you instantiate your GraphQL client in the first place, and you would wrap your React component tree with an Apollo provider. And this is how, for example, a minimal component wrapping looks like. So you have here, you have your app component, which just maps over all items, and that you have your items available. You take a higher order component called GraphQL, you wrap your app component with your GraphQL query, and Apollo automatically resolves your data and injects it, that you can iterate over it. So that's super simple. So to quickly recap, what we want to focus on today is not implementing the API layer using REST, but actually using GraphQL. And on the front end, we will be using the Apollo client. So no matter how the API layer would look like, this actually introduces a bunch of complexity, both on the code side and also on the infrastructure management side, since we have to deal with databases, deploying the API individually. So what Now, for example, did for deploying these APIs, we are also looking for better abstraction, better workflows around working with your database. And this is exactly what we're doing at GraphQL, which I want to demo to you today. So what is GraphQL? GraphQL is a GraphQL backend development platform, and you can think about it in two ways. So one about the technology, and one about what the platform directly provides. So the technology is sort of an abstraction. So the way how it works is that you just need to specify and design your data model using GraphQL, STL, what we've seen before. And based on that data model, it generates a GraphQL API on top of that. So think about it a bit like Firebase, but for GraphQL, but actually with an API that's so flexible compared to SQL. And that as a foundation, we also give you a framework how you can implement authentication, permissions, and implement your own business logic in an event-driven way. The platform then is like very similar to what Now is doing for your Node apps. Our platform is doing for your GraphQL backends. So it helps you with the hosting of your database and the API. It gives you collaboration workflows. We're going to see that in a second. So you can just install it via npm using npm install global GraphQL. And this is how it looks like when you're getting started. So I hope that's not too small. So you would just be running GraphQL init. There's like an interactive initialize method, and that should get you going. So what that does, it generates a GraphQL YAML file. In that YAML file, that's sort of like the root definition of your project. So here you specify your path to your types.graphql file. We have a look into that in a second. This is where your entire data model is specified. You also have a way here to specify permissions for your data model, and you can specify functions. So your data model is specified in this types.graphql file. Here, for example, we have a super simple data model where we have a user, and the user has like first name, last name, and has a bunch of orders. An order is delivery date and Stripe token, and belongs to a certain user. And using this data model, you can specify relations, you can specify database constraints, whether something is unique, or whether multiple fields together are unique, and so on. So basically, it's an abstraction over the schema definition of your database. The API that's generated on top of that, we've earlier seen it already when we've done a GraphQL query. That's super flexible. So you can query your data by just traversing the data graph. You have filtering capabilities that are very similar to what you could do with SQL, but mapped to a more intuitive GraphQL API. You can paginate over your data, you can sort your data. So whatever data requirements you really have, you can express using this GraphQL API. Additionally to that, we expose a GraphQL subscription API, which allow you to implement real-time applications. So if you want to build a chat app or something like that, this is where you also can use the real-time API. And it supports all available GraphQL clients like Facebook's Relay or Apollo client, but you don't have to use a GraphQL client. You can also just use fetch or curl from your CLI. The authentication and permission system basically allows you to implement any sort of auth flow that you want. So you can use Facebook auth or Twitter auth or Zeit's new OAuth flow out of the box. You can also implement your own one if you have like a custom authentication single sign-on flow, for example. In terms of authorization, where you govern who can access and do what, you can use a super flexible permission system where you can, based on the relational structure of your data graph, specify conditions, what is possible and what should be denied. Functions allow you to implement business logic and extend the API on its own. You can either implement these functions directly based on the GraphQL platform, or it supports webhooks. So what we'll do today is actually deploy these functions using Now and use the webhooks as a part of GraphQL. So let's use the rest of our time to actually do the live demo. So what we want to do is we want to build a little web shop. So what it will actually be capable of, it will list all of the items that you have available. You can put these items into your shopping cart, and there will be a checkout process. So that you can do the checkout in the first place and that you can put things into your shopping cart, you need to authenticate. This is what we'll be using Auth0 for. And when you actually do checkout, we will be paying for our order using Stripe. And once the order has been completed, we will send a confirmation mail using Mailgun. So here, what we'll be doing. So first, I want to show you a bit of like what the code base looks like, and that you understand more of the flows of the application. And afterwards, we'll go through the setup process. So we'll set up the GraphQL project. We'll deploy our function using Now. We'll get all of the credentials from Stripe and Mailgun and so on. We'll configure that. We'll seed some initial data. And yeah, then fingers crossed that the app actually works. Disclaimer, we've built that literally last night at 2 a.m. So thanks to Tim and Nico back then who helped getting that accomplished. So the code base we'll look into in a second. The front end is built using Next.js. So I think you should be familiar with the structure, like you have your pages, some components, and I'll walk you through some of the more custom library code, which is actually based on the Apollo example from Next.js. And on the backend side, we will be looking into the GraphQL YAML file, which is the foundation for your app, and also what the data model looks like. And we will be looking into two functions. One, the function that actually implements the checkout process, and secondly, into the function that sends the confirmation email. The checkout process on its own works like that you say, okay, I have a user and I want to authenticate as that user in the first place to get the context that I can put things into my basket. So I can then put items into my basket. Once I'm happy with my basket, I'm creating an order. I need to pay for that order, and once I've paid for that order using Stripe, that will set the order at timestamp on my order node. which then on its own triggers the send customer mail. So this is, hope not too confusing. I'll walk you through it in a second how that works. All right. All right, I hope you can read that. So what we'll basically be doing is let's check out the code base, which is, by the way, also available here if you want to check it out later on. I'll also tweet a link to the slides so you can find it. So let's first have a look into the front end. So the front end here, we have our pages, we have our index app, our index route, which looks something like this. So let's go back to that in a second. We have a couple of other routes, for example, for our basket and for the checkout process and success screen. The components are not that spectacular, but let's have a quick look into the lib. So one here we have some code that initializes the Apollo client. Again, this is just based on the Next.js example of Apollo, so you can check that out in your own time. And then there's also a helper function or a higher order component which basically enables server-side rendering for Apollo using the get initial props. So that's a bit technical how that works, but you can just check that out. That just makes sure that server-side rendering is supported using GraphQL. So that's basically the front end. And now let's have a quick look into the structure of the backend. So everything here is in a folder we called GraphQL, and here you have the GraphQL YAML file, which again is the foundation of your backend here. So we reference here to our data model, and here we've specified a bunch of functions. So let's first start with our data model. In our data model, we have here items. An item has rating information. You can put items into a basket, and a basket, when you're happy with it, you can create an order from which, once you've paid for it, is actually completed. So let's go back to our GraphQL YAML file. Here we actually do have two functions. So this one function here is of a type called resolver. So what it actually does is it extends your GraphQL API with a mutation called pay, which expects the order ID and a Stripe token and returns whether it was successful or not. And the actual implementation of this, we won't go through it in full detail, but on a high level, it here gets back your order from your API, creates a Stripe customer, creates a charge on your Stripe account, updates the order, and that's basically it. And this function we will deploy using now, and take the webhook and put it back here into your GraphQL YAML file, which we'll do by an environment variable. The send confirmation email is super simple. This function is actually deployed using GraphQL directly, just that you see which options you have for that. And yeah, this is just using Mailgun to send an email. Pretty simple. So yeah, I would say let's give it a shot. And what we'll do first is we're gonna create a new GraphQL project based on what we have here. So think about this like as your template for your project. This will create the GraphQL project in the first place. I hope my internet's working. Okay, perfect. So what we'll get here is it says, okay, here's it says, okay, we have your GraphQL YAML file and your types. That's what we've created. And here it automatically gives us a GraphQL endpoint, which we can use. And we say, all right, give me all items as we've done before, the image URL and the description, and we can query that, and it's empty. Obviously, because we haven't seeded any data, so what we can do, I've just prepared here a little script called seed.js, which just creates a bunch of data. So let's run that. Once that's done, we should be able, hold on. I have, by the way, maybe you can hear me better like this. So here we're using the GraphQL endpoint that we've just created. So first, we need to inject that into our environment variables. We do that here. Reload my environment variables, seed the data, and profit. Awesome. So as a next step, we have here in our package.json, we've said, okay, the pay.js is actually our default function, so we want to deploy that using now. Let's actually also include the stripe key environment variable. While we are deploying that, let's have a look back into which environment variables we actually have here. This is what I've used last night. Here we are configuring our stripe key, and here we are configuring my Mailgun credentials. If you want to copy that, it's a test account, feel free. So in the meanwhile, let's actually start the front end. So here I have just basically I'm using here yarn dev to start Next, and it should be serving on localhost 3000. So we'll open that in a second. The last thing we'll just do is copy over our now endpoint from here back into our environment variables, replace the endpoint here, and deploy the GraphQL project one last time to take into account the new function. That is done. And now let's have a look at our front end. And hopefully we should be good to go. So this is how our wonderful front end looks like. You can buy like an iPhone X, you can buy a new haircut, you can buy MacBook, a typical house. But that we can do so, we actually first need to log in. And this is what works with auth0. This is some code I haven't showed you, but this is what we've just installed out of the box using auth0 function, which you can also modify. But here we're just using auth0. So we can say, okay, I want to log in here as me. And okay, now we can actually start buying things. So I totally want him. And I want to get an iPad Pro. Okay, we have 2 items in our basket. Let's go to our basket. Perfect. We want to check out. Here, please don't use my credit card number. And okay, wow, that's an expensive haircut, but let's do that. Okay, that should have worked. Give it a second. And okay, looks like there's a problem with the deployed function. Let's give this one more shot. It's a live demo, happens. Okay. Let's do the express checkout. Okay, this time take an iPhone. Check out. All right. No. Seems like there's a problem with the deployed now function, but I don't want to ruin your lunch. I will actually debug this and put it online. It was just a timing issue. It was just a timing issue. Okay. Okay, it was actually just a Wi-Fi issue apparently. So if it was successful, I should also have gotten an email by now that my order is confirmed. So, all right. Whew. So again, the code is available on GitHub. So the takeaway for you here is if you're building awesome web apps and deploy them using Now, GraphQL is a great complement for the database part here. So I just want to share a few quick resources with you. We also put up a tutorial online shortly on our blog where you see how that works using Next. If GraphQL is new to you and if you want to get more into that, you can do so by going to howtographql.com, where you pretty much for every technology available, you find great GraphQL tutorials. You can also check out the GraphQL newsletter, or if you're interested how Firebase, for example, compares to GraphQL, there's also a blog article on our blog for that. If you are not yet part of our community, you can also join there on our Slack or join our forum. And yeah, what I've shown you right now is actually currently in beta. You can learn more about that in the forum. Next month, we'll have a pretty big announcement where we tell you how you can run GraphQL locally and even deploy it on your own servers. And yeah, that was it.